All right. Well, so we've been studying in the book of Malachi, prophecies of Malachi. We're going to continue our studies this morning. So if you want to start by turning with me to Malachi chapter 2. And again, we've kind of mentioned this before, but Malachi is broken up into these different discourses. So we've already read the first discourse, which went from approximately chapter 1, verse 1 to 1, verse 5. The second discourse runs from 1, verse 6 to chapter 2, verse 9, and that's where we finished during our last class. And now we're going to start the third discourse in Malachi, and that starts in chapter 2, verse 10, and it ends at verse 16. Before we read that, just kind of recapping a little bit of where we are, just for context, the discourse we just finished reading dealt with the priests. It talked about some of the things that were going on in the priesthood and the corruptions that were taking place, and Malachi shared some things that were just really disturbing that was going on, the way they were offering sacrifices that were blind and lame, and then really they just weren't being the spiritual leaders that they needed to be for the people. And if you read chapter 2 in verse 8, it says, "But you have departed from the way, you have caused many to stumble at the law, you have corrupted the covenant of Levi," says the Lord of hosts. And that kind of just tells you what's going on in the priesthood at this time and place. And and this will kind of become relevant at what we're looking at in our next section here, is this time and place is after the exile. The children of Israel, they've gone off into the exile, and then Darius or Cyrus, whichever how you want to express him, made this call to send the people back to the land, and now they've gone back and they've rebuilt the temple. The priesthood is operational, and they're starting to go back into the very practices that got them in trouble in the first place. And so those are what we looked at before. And again, this is being led by the priesthood, and I think that's going to tip over into what we're looking at this morning as well. So I guess we can just go ahead and read verses 10 through 16 of chapter 2.
Have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously, every man against his brother, by profaning the covenant of our fathers? Judah hath dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord which he loved, and hath married the daughter of a strange god. The Lord will cut off the man that doeth this, the master and the scholar, out of the tabernacles of Jacob, and him that offereth an offering unto the Lord of hosts. Did you say 16?
Yeah, to verse 16, please.
And this have ye done again, covering the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with crying out, insomuch that he regardeth not the offering any more, or receiveth it with good will at your hand. Yet ye say, Wherefore? Because the Lord hath been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously. Yet is she thy companion, and the wife of thy covenant. And did not he make one? Yet had he the residue of the Spirit. And wherefore one? That he might seek a godly seed. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away. For one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that ye deal not treacherously.
All right, thank you. And then the next discourse starts in verse 17. And so that's one of the things when you read Malachi, it's a little bit hard when you do chapter by chapter, because it doesn't necessarily follow the breakdown as it's given. But anyway, so in those verses, there's kind of two issues that Malachi brings up. One is that they're marrying these daughters of foreign gods. The other is they're putting away their wife of their youth. And I think when you look at what's happening, these things are connected. It's not like there's two things going on, but these are two connected things that are taking place in Israel at this time. And again, we talked about this, that in terms of the timing, this is in the return from the exile. So what I want to do is I just want to read some of that narrative, and that's going to be found in Ezra and Nehemiah, that talks about some of the things that were going on, and that kind of, I think, will help shed some context on what's happening here. So if you want to turn, we'll start by looking at Ezra chapter 9. And just looking at those first 3 verses of Ezra chapter 9.
After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, "The people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanite, Hittite, Perizzite, Jebusite, Ammonite, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons and have mingled the holy race with the people around them. And the leaders and the officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness."
Right. Well, verse 3, but I guess just kind of his reaction.
"When I heard this, I tore my tunic and cloak, pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat down appalled."
Thank you. So you read what's going on. It talks about it says they're not separating themselves from the people of the land. So they have all these different, the same people they've always lived near, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Moabites, etc. And it calls out and it says the priests and the Levites have done this. And it goes on to say, indeed, the hand of the leaders and rulers have been foremost in this trespass. I think that's important because back in Malachi, what we looked at last week, he was kind of focused on the corruption in the priesthood, right? So I think actually it doesn't spell it out in Malachi, but I think this is probably, it's kind of a continuation of problems that are going on in the priesthood, that they were supposed to live a certain way, they're supposed to conduct themselves a certain way, and they weren't. Let's just talk a minute about, what's going on here. So you've got these people coming back from exile, and particularly the priests and the leaders. And why is there such a strong draw for them to sort of intermarry with people who are not just not Israelites, but people who just completely worship foreign gods? Because we're not talking about a situation, you think about, remember Ruth, Ruth by birth was what? A Moabite, right? But her marriage to Boaz was celebrated. And why was her celebrated versus this is a bad thing? Yeah.
She was embracing the worship of the Lord, whereas the other people were trying to blend the two, trying to bring something in and accommodate something that should not be. She was putting away where she came from and taking on something new and better. And the Israelites were trying to straddle the fence.
Yeah. Yeah, so with Ruth, remember she made that famous utterance before when she came back with Naomi. She said, "Your people will be my people, your God will be my God." She says, if I forget how it ends, something, if even death should separate us. I forget how it works, but it was like kind of like a covenant, like, nothing, this is going to be death to us part. She's basically, it's almost, we read this at weddings, but which is appropriate, I think. But I even think about baptism, because that's what we do when we get baptized, right? We're leaving behind the world and the gods and all the things and we're joining ourselves to Christ and the community of Israel. And that's kind of what Ruth is doing. She's leaving behind and she's joining herself to that community. So when she gets married to Boaz, it's celebrated, right? Because here's a woman of faith who's become part of the Israel. But here, what they're still worshiping these foreign idols. These are like, they haven't changed their practices. These are people that have, and we'll see that later on, we'll look at some other passages, but this is what's happening, is that they're actually, these are still idol worshipers. It's not like they're joining the community of Israel and getting married. They're still doing the old abominations. Yes?
I think part of the problem with the priests was that they had been away from the temple for 50 to 70 years, depending on what timeline you like to use. And so they did not have in their thinking the duties of a priest. They just saw it as, that's who we are by birth, but so they didn't value what the priesthood was all about. And I think that's why they tended to just look around and marry who they wanted to.
Yeah.
If we take off our Bible perspective hat and put on a modern day hat, and maybe from a humanist perspective of people around us, this is blatantly racism, right? They're not Jews, can't have anything to do with them. As well as freedom of religion, well, that's their religion, it should be okay with you, you should just let it go. So, just every now and then step out of our being raised or strongly, influenced by the Bible teachings, and just think how this looks to people around us. And you realize, even though we don't have a priesthood and all that, we're in the same situation. We're always told that everything should be okay, and you should have as many affiliations as you want. And this is what the world is pushing on us all the time. And we're really in this same situation.
Yeah, and just trying to understand what's going on in the mind of the priests and these leaders, because it specifically calls out the leaders when they're coming back into the land. And talking about marriage today, usually we get married because we find someone we feel compatible with, we like them, and it's usually kind of more of an individual thing, right? This is someone we like, we get married. What happened back then? Marriage was a little bit different, right? Who was involved a lot of times in the marriage decision making? Your parents, right? And marriage was not just a social thing, but if you're a leader, what was marriage used for? Joe.
Treaties, contracts, business, development of your little empire so that you can advance yourself. So I'll give you, for instance, in America, the Ansonia Clock Company in Connecticut they married into an Italian sculptor family so that they would do the sculpting for the clocks and they would make the other family would make the clock. So it was a marriage of convergence of two different uses to make bigger business.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think that it kind of helps us understand what the pressure is here, because you've been out of the land for about 70 years, right? And you're coming back. Do you have, you think about, this is an agrarian society, right? A lot of this is done, you got livestock, things like that. And the people of the land, these other leaders, they're established, right? So, if you're entering a marriage with them, these are people who are established leaders. They've got money, they've got connections. Pragmatically, this makes sense, right? Tying yourself to, what's the other issue? These people were what? They're like their enemies, right? They're living right next to their enemies. So when you're marrying like the Canaanites, Perizzites, what is this also probably doing? It's almost like a peace treaty, because that's how they would do that. Back in those days, is you would make peace with somebody by entering into a marriage alliance. And so I think that probably gives us a little bit of context. So we'll see later on that there's some evidence of that what's going on is that this is kind of again, like practically speaking, this makes sense. You're coming in from this land from 70 years, you've really got nothing established, but now you've got these established people. They have business, they have commerce, they have their flocks, they have the political connections, and if you can enter into alliance with them, that could be good news for you. So I think that's probably why the leaders get called out, because I think that's probably what they're doing, is they're probably trying to really solidify their position in the land by intermingling with again, people who don't worship God. They worship these foreign idols and so forth. All right, so just taking 1 second to look back at Deuteronomy and why they were warned against this. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Verses 1 through 5. If you don't mind reading that.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus shall you deal with them You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their asherim and burn their carved images with fire.
Actually, read verse 6. I think that kind of ends it really nice, if you don't mind. Yeah, verse 6 as well.
For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth.
So this is kind of the background of that rationale, is that would go, the Lord is saying that, these Canaanites, Perizzites, all these, they were being destroyed out of the land because of the wicked things that they were doing. They were doing all these wicked, abominable things, and they eventually, that was the whole idea, is that he was going to drive them out of the land and replace them with the children of Israel, a holy people who was a treasure to him. That's why he says, if you start intermarrying, you're going to worship their gods. They might worship, you're going to start breaking down this covenant relationship they have with God and their distinct, the fact that they were distinct people. And so this is something he warned against, and this is kind of the background. It's just the fear of turning them away from the Lord. And so that's kind of the background of where this comes from. And that is, eventually what happens in their history is they start adopting all these idols from other nations, and they start bringing in all these practices, and that becomes their downfall. And here they are, they're kind of going down that path again. We see that happening. History is repeating itself. All right, so I'll read one other place historically just to kind of get some context. Let's turn over to Nehemiah chapter 13. And, we've talked about this before, but some people think that Malachi's prophecies were given actually in the time period leading up to Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah left Judea. He goes back to the king of Persia, and he's working for him for a while, and then he comes back and he finds things are a mess. And then it's during his absence, and some people think that's when Malachi's prophecies were given. We can't say for certain. There's definitely overlap of issues, but that's just one possible conjecture that people put. But anyway, Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 23 to 29.
Nehemiah 13. In those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, We shall not give your daughters, ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, neither take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God, to marry strange wives? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elisha, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood, and the covenant of the priesthood, and of the Levites.
All right, so again, you're reading in Nehemiah, we saw this in the time of, and Ezra and Nehemiah, how much they overlap, I'm not sure, but in time-wise, but in any case, the same things are happening in the exile. And Nehemiah comes back and he finds that they are marrying women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Again, marrying these foreign nations. And as a result, what happened to their children? Yeah,
their language is that you want to have a nation disintegrate into the world. Let them stop speaking their language.
Yeah.
It's so subtle too, but it happens.
Yeah, they can't speak the language, and yeah, you're right, that's part of your national identity, isn't it? The language you speak, and when that starts to break down. But the other thing is, what were God's laws written in? Yeah, at that time, it's not like today where you had, a Bible where you can look it up online and see 50 different languages. if you stopped understanding Hebrew, you stopped being able to read the Bible. Now, eventually they translated into Greek and things like that, but at this time and place, this is really the only way you're going to hear the Word of God. And yeah.
Talking about modern times, we can research anything quickly and bring it back. Back then, once the parents died, that history died with them. I mean, so much would be lost within just a couple of generations. They didn't have dictionaries, or we can go back and read the history books like that. They had the law, but the access to those things become more and more limited as the people who used to speak it die.
Yeah.
We didn't have the resources we have today to restore something. So,
I think I saw Martha over there, maybe. No, okay. But yeah, so one of the immediate effects is that the kids are no longer, yeah, like you said, that a lot of this stuff is being passed down generation to generation. How did Moses say you were supposed to teach your kids? She'll speak when you're walking, when you're in your house. I forget, I should have quoted that one, but it's the one we quote a lot about how they're supposed to teach in the family the things about the truth, but they can't speak the language. I think that's a first step away from losing their communication with God. It's actually an interesting thing. Hebrew actually disappeared for a while as a spoken language. I didn't realize this till several years ago. I read this book, I think his name was Eliezer Ben Yehuda, and it was a guy that actually kind of helped revive the Hebrew language. This was back in the mid-1800s. It was a really fascinating story if you've never read it, but it's like the spoken language, they still use it as in some religious practice, but nobody spoke Hebrew anymore. And then this guy kind of came and he actually sort of rebuilt the Hebrew language. And today there's like, however many people, maybe 10 million or so that can speak it. I don't know, but it's just kind of an interesting story. But that's starting to happen here. So that's one of the things that we see is that the language is starting to disappear. And of course, what Nehemiah does is he kind of looks what we looked at is he goes back to the history and he says, basically God said you're not supposed to do this, one thing. But we see this from history because who fell into the same trap? Solomon, our wise king, this guy who was known for his wisdom, he was blessed by God with all these riches, and yet at the end, his bad choice, and he started marrying all these foreign women, and they were leading him away from the Lord, and that became the downfall of Solomon. And so that's what that Nehemiah is trying to tell him. Look, if you go down this path, this brought Solomon away. It'll happen to you as well. Yeah.
Has a great parallel to the time of the judges, because that's when there was so much failure through compromise. And you're seeing that again here. You're seeing the compromise of making treaties with foreign nations, which you just pointed out in Deuteronomy 7 is a problem. Intermarrying with them, being influenced by them. And people call it watering down. I would call it replacement of God's word. So the same gestalt problem that they had when they were during the time of the judges is also reappearing here. And all the same steps are falling apart. That's why God sent them judges, and you're seeing Nehemiah and Ezra having to do all this heavy lifting on their own, and having been threatened from the inside, which is also a huge problem. Like with Sanballat and Tobijah, they were always waiting to try to crush them, destroy them, remove them from power.
Yeah, and it's interesting you kind of call out these people, Sanballat, the Horonite, and this is, so it says Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, is his son-in-law, right? And I think it goes back to what we talked about. Let's look at this guy Sanballat just for a minute to understand who's this family that they married into? What's their background with Israel? So look at a few passages in Nehemiah. I'll start in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10.
But when
Sanballat one night, and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this. It displeased him greatly that someone came to seek the welfare of the people of Israel.
All right, so, here's the first time this guy is mentioned in Nehemiah, and he's upset because he sees that Nehemiah is coming. He's got this army from the king, and he realizes somebody's going to seek the welfare of Israel. I think that's the first sign where he's like, this guy does not have Israel's interests in mind. They see these Jews coming back in the land, not as a good thing, but as a threat, right? Just like in modern times, when the Israelites came back, it was a lot of tension because they understood what was happening, that they were coming back and taking over. Well, that's what's happening again. They don't like the idea that all these Jews are going to be coming back from Persia because now they're going to become a nation again, and they can't exploit what was going on there. And so it says that they were, my version says, deeply disturbed. That's how he felt about Nehemiah coming back. And if you read the background, Nehemiah was given like a command of troops from the king, and he was very well supplied. So they were getting some real help at this time from Nehemiah, and he does not like it. The next one, verse 19, if you just look down a little bit more, maybe 18 and 19 for context.
I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked us and despised us and said, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?
And so Nehemiah starts to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. That's the big issue. When he comes back, he finds the wall is broken down. The people are kind of defenseless. They're in a bad situation. And he kind of comes back. He brings some leadership, and they decide to rise up and rebuild this wall. And again, it's how Sanballat and these other guys, these other leaders around them, they said they mocked us, they despised them. And so these are not friends of Israel. These are people that are not happy about them coming back. And so that's another little nugget about Sanballat. Look at chapter 4, verse 1.
But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews.
Oh, you can read verse 2 as well, sorry.
And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, What do these feeble Jews? And they fortify themselves. Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned?
Yeah, so here he is. It's once again, you've seen them rebuilding. They're starting to progress, and they're still mocking them. There are these people on the side. They're just shouting these insults at them, trying to discourage them, trying to prevent what they're doing. And again, this is not a guy who has any love for God's people. And then we looked at 4, verse 1. And then also going to read verses 7 and 8 as well in that same chapter.
It came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Amorites and the Ashdobites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth. They conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it.
Okay, so when they see the wall starting to come back up, and they suddenly realize, okay, this guy's actually getting things done. This is serious now. This isn't a joke. He's actually rebuilding the walls. So what's their next level? What are they planning to do?
They frustrate the plans, but more importantly, they write a letter to the king, and they say, if you do this, you're going to lose all your revenue west of the Euphrates. So do us a favor. Go to your librarian, talk to the archivist, get all the documents back from the file called Israel, and check it out. See if they paid tribute after they redid this and redid that. And so I don't know who in their little camp had that wisdom, but it worked, because when they went back to the king and he made a search of the royal archives, they found exactly what they said to be true, which was skewed, but so they were like, okay, stop all this work because we're not gonna, if they're independent at all, if they have any autonomy, we're gonna lose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's coming from Ezra, the time period of Ezra, is that when they wrote the letter and they stopped, because they stopped building for a while. That was when they were building a temple, and then that's, yeah.
Nehemiah, and they had somebody make a threat, and I think he said, you better go hide in the temple because they're going to try to kill you. And he's like, I'm not doing that. You know, that's just wicked. So he doesn't fall for it, and that's why I'm saying there's internal threats. It's not just correcting the people and their bad behavior. He's got direct threats from within the Jewish population that are being influenced by Sanballat and Tobijah.
Yeah, this is, in my version, it says they tried to create confusion. They're attacking and create confusion. Now, so when I hear that create confusion, that's what I think that it's talking about. It's like internal people that they're using. Because when that happens with nations today, well, you know, like, you know, back in the day when the CIA used to overturn nations, what would they do? Yeah, they would find somebody who was willing to like do a coup, and that's happening to, you see that in Africa. There's all these coups taking place, and who's backing? You know, who's giving them some backing and all these things? The Russians, right? Yeah. So this is how you, like, if you want to like just, you know, break down a nation, you find internal, you know, people willing to betray them and create some internal issues. Is that the 5-minute bell? Okay, I know. Okay. So anyway, these are, you know, just kind of getting some context of who this Sanballat guy is. And I think that, and what you're going to see is over and over again, when he tries to create problems for Nehemiah, what does Nehemiah do? He doesn't bend. When he hears that they're going to attack him, what does he do? He tells everybody to do what? When you're building, 5 minutes, okay. You know, wear a sword on one side and work with the, you know, it kind of talks about they have like a sword in one hand and a rock, and, you know, they're building and they're also being ready. So Nehemiah, rather than being intimidated, he just adjusts the strategy, right? He makes sure that people are protected. But when we get to the end, what, yeah, Joe?
Just has a 24/7 watch, and that's why they're forced to basically finish this thing in 52 days. I mean, it's incredible that you could rebuild with walls of an entire city in that amount of time. There's no government project, whether it's a bridge or a highway or a building, that is done in this short of time. It's less than 2 months. I mean, you think about rebuilding an entire city wall in less than 2 months. None of these people are professional masons. None of them are professional quarriers. Everybody has different occupations. Even some of the women it lists that are involved for their section of the wall, you know, do this in the same amount of time. So there's a great amount of a sense of urgency that he's able to maintain. And we just don't have that sense of urgency today at all.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, and I agree with that. Anyone that's ever worked in a trade building something knows that there's so many different groups involved, and usually there's a project manager that oversees everybody, but those are individual companies, individual groups with their own individual goals, and they try to get on board, and sometimes it's better than others. But I think what that shows us is when the Lord is involved, and that's what true harmony is. And I think that was probably a really, truly amazing experience, that there was none of these impediments, and usually it's a difference of opinion on a lot of things on all different levels that causes things to slow down, and there not being this flow and harmony. So I agree with Joe. I think that's just one of those little hidden gems that points towards the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and so, you know, with Nehemiah, again, he's responding, instead of being, you know, pressured, he just kind of pushes back and he keeps pushing forward. He just, you see this in chapter 6, you know, we won't read it, but chapter 6, there's like all these things. It's Tobiah and Sanballat, and they're doing all these things to try to disrupt him. They send him a letter and say, hey, let's come talk. And he's like, I'm not going to come talk to you. And then they actually hire someone to be a prophet. It's really, if you read it, it's a really bizarre thing, but they basically try to create this fake prophet to come in there and intimidate Nehemiah, and he doesn't buy it. You know, he sees right through this. But anyway, that's just kind of the background of this guy Sanballat. And Nehemiah's response was, I'm not going to back down. Well, when we get to chapter 13, what is I forget the priest's name. Is it the son is Eliashib and the dad is no, the son is sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest. It doesn't name, it's just one of the sons. But anyway, this high priest, what does he do? He says, I'm going to marry my son in a marriage alliance to Sanballat. And that's how he fixed the problem. So I just wanted to read it, kind of contrast the way they address this thing, because that's what's happening here, is that they're basically capitulating. Instead of standing against this evil, they're saying, okay, we're just going to enter an alliance. So we'll kind of end there, but and I guess next week we'll probably just quickly wrap up what we looked at and move into the next discourse. But that's just, this is the next issue that Malachi was dealing with, is that they were not only entering into marriages, but they were doing this with people that had Israel's harm in mind. So thank you.